LiSTNR production.
A warning. This episode contains graphic descriptions of intimate partner violence. Please listen with care. Welcome to Crime Insiders Forensics. For those joining us for the first time, my name's Kathryn Fox. I'm a former GP, crime author and screenwriter. I'm enthralled by forensics and have spent thousands of hours researching for books and screenplays. So I thought, why not turn my research into a podcast? Every week, you'll be joining me in discovering how forensic science is helping solve high-profile crimes in Australia and around the world. This week, part 2 of my chat with forensic psychologist Professor Troy McEwan. If you haven't heard part 1, I suggest you go back and listen to that episode first so you can get context into the psychology and motivations of stalkers. We'll continue along the same vein, this time discussing how victims of stalking are systemically let down and what can be done about it.
Fundamentally, I think there's a misunderstanding that stalking isn't very common and it's not very serious, and occasionally bad things happen, but broadly we probably do okay, and it's just an inaccurate understanding.
24-year-old Alice Ruggles was stalked and murdered by her ex-boyfriend in 2016. Alice did all the recommended things, reporting her stalker's dangerous behaviour to the police on multiple occasions.
I split up with my boyfriend about 3 months ago. Since then, I know that he's hacked into my Facebook and also my phone. He's been sending me a lot of messages even though I've asked him not to contact me.
Unfortunately, Alice's story is not a one-off. It's a typical story illustrating the link between coercive behaviour and stalking.
In this case, you can really see that continuation of coercive control into stalking post-relationship.
So, how do the police handle reports of stalking?
They're not walking in reporting a theft that happened yesterday and it's over. They're in the middle of being assaulted.
Before we begin, I'd like to encourage all of our listeners to please visit the Alice Ruggles Trust website and social media channels. You'll find the links in the show notes. Now, here's Troy.
I'll just preface this by saying that I've been in touch with Alice's parents, and so Clive Ruggles has very kindly agreed to let us speak about this today, which is very kind of him. They're very active in the UK in pushing for better recognition of stalking, for changes to legislation, for better kind of responses to stalking across the board. So they're always keen to have their daughter Alice's case discussed for that reason.
Thank you for actually doing that too, because I think it's really important that in cases like this, we're not just being gratuitous. It's not taking advantage of somebody's incredible loss. It's an attempt to actually educate and hopefully save other people from going through something similar.
Yeah, it's an essential point, and it's a really tricky issue in working in this space, is that there is a salaciousness to talking about this, and there is we're on a true crime podcast. It's a very good true crime podcast, but there absolutely are, cases where people just want to talk about it because it's interesting. And I suppose talking about these cases and focusing on cases that end in homicide, while they're very unusual stalking cases, often everything up to the homicide is not unusual. And so in Alice's case in particular, the stalking has very many characteristics that are completely ordinary. And then there's a point at which it does become more extraordinary, and obviously Alice was killed by her ex-partner. But usually the cases when they end in homicide, we know more about the case. It's more public, so therefore we can talk about it. Like, I can't talk about cases that I know from my work because they're not public. So that's part of the reason we focus on the homicide cases very often. And I just want to emphasise that they're not usual. They are very much the extraordinary case. And for most people who are stalked, the stalking will stop and it won't involve physical violence, or certainly not fatal violence. So just kind of take that into account when listening to a case that ends in homicide, I think. So Alice is a 24-year-old woman. She was very, very well loved by her family and reportedly very well loved by everyone who knew her. And she was killed by her ex-boyfriend. Well, she'd known him for a year at the time of her death, and she'd broken up with him about 2.5 months before she was killed by him. So Alice's situation was that she'd commenced a relationship, that he had contacted her, he'd seen her on Facebook, friend of a friend, seen her on Facebook, kind of got in touch with her, asked to be linked up by this friend. They'd started a relationship kind of online. He was overseas at the time, so they texted, they called, they kind of started a relationship online. After about 3 months, he moved back to the UK for a short time, and they met each other in person in January of 2016. That relationship kind of continued. They perceived they were going out before that, but the relationship continued when they met each other in person. They were together for about a month. He then got sent back overseas. He was in the military, so he was being kind of deployed internationally. And the relationship continued. He was away for some time, then came back, I think about a month later. And then they were in a relationship kind of in person, if you like, for probably about 3 to 4 months, let's say 4 months, until August of 2016. Even during that time, they actually lived separately. So Alice lived in Gateshead, which is up near Newcastle in the northeast of England, and her boyfriend was posted to Edinburgh in Scotland. It's about a 2.5-hour drive. The relationship started off very positively, but fairly quickly it was evident that they weren't very happy. There were lots of arguments. And in hindsight, after Alice's death, a lot of people spoke about the fact that in the relationship, her boyfriend was actually very controlling. So this is where we see this kind of coercive control kind of pattern. It's very, very clear in this relationship, where he got very jealous of Alice having any contact with other people. He did things to isolate her, like he asked her to make all her social media private so other men couldn't see her on her social media. He would check where she was all the time. So this kind of surveillance and monitoring. Remember, they're living in 2 different cities, so he'd be calling her and texting her. And he'd even do things like he'd show up uninvited at locations where she had to go away for work or something, or she was doing something, and he'd turn up. And remember, he lives 2.5 hours away. So this isn't just kind of an accidental thing. So this kind of intrusiveness, even within the relationship, when she's voluntarily in a relationship with him, and she wants to be in that relationship, he's kind of pushing his way into her life in ways that aren't okay. So kind of by kind of March of 2016, this was having effects on Alice. She was being isolated from friends. He actually threatened some of her male housemates that she lived with. He threatened them to stay away from her. Though relationships broke down, she ended up moving out of that house. She moved in with a work colleague. And then she started to develop suspicions that he was being unfaithful to her. She confronted him about this, and there was lots of kind of, protestations and backwards and forwards, lots of arguments. And by early August, she had decided to leave the relationship. She thought, no, this is not good enough. He was too controlling and he was too in her life, and she didn't trust him anymore, so she ended the relationship. So she ended it in the very first week of August in 2016. And pretty much immediately after the relationship was ended, the stalking began, and all those behaviours that she'd experienced during the relationship continued following the end. So in this case, you can really see that continuation of coercive control into stalking post-relationship. And so her now ex-boyfriend, starts texting and calling constantly. She refuses to talk to him. So then he calls friends and family members and work colleagues, trying to get them to kind of encourage her to resume the relationship with him. He veers between anger and intimidation and kind of saying he loves her and wanting to be with her. He threatens to kill himself at various points. She's quite concerned for him. When he first threatens to kill himself, she actually gets in touch with his army base and says, look, he's not well, can someone go check? And then when they go check on him, he's absolutely fine and says, no, Alice is making up stories. So then, she seems like she's, out of control. So this all kind of goes on for some time. In September, so like a month after they break up, he actually travels down to Gateshead and he shows up at her flat late at night, kind of knocking on the door. He's not there. He's pretending he's somewhere else, but then he turns up at the window and he gives her chocolates and flowers and whatever. It's like, middle of the night kind of thing. All very strange. Alice is increasingly frightened of this. She thinks he's hacking into her social media and her phone accounts, and he actually later on agrees when she confronts him with this, because things are happening. He knows things he shouldn't know. And then she starts in September, she starts seeing another guy. She's met someone else and she starts having kind of contact and communication with this other guy. And the ex-boyfriend realises this and contacts this other man, because again, can get information, contacts the man and said, she's two-timing us and whatever. And so trying to interfere with her relationships, trying to, kind of control her. So Alice eventually goes to the police on the 1st of October for the first time. She actually tried to call the police a week prior to that, but she was on hold for 7 minutes and eventually gave up. So she calls the police on the 1st of October. They take an initial report. They send a police officer around to speak to her. That police officer says, oh, actually, this is more concerning than that initial report made it seem, and actually does quite a thorough kind of chat, does a risk assessment, assesses her as being at medium risk using the particular tool that they use in the UK, and is sufficiently concerned. He suggests to Alice that they could take out what they had at the time in the UK called police information notice. I think it's called a PIN. And essentially it's a safety notice. In Australia we have a similar thing where police can kind of say you give a person a formal warning saying you need to stop doing what you're doing. And if you don't, we will go further. So they took that path in this case on that first occasion. And Alice was quite happy with that by all accounts. She really didn't want him to be arrested. She just wanted the stalking to stop. And she felt that this would be effective. She was told quite clearly that if he then contacted her again, then they would proceed with charging him with harassment. So that was actually never communicated to him by the police. They called his base and the army communicated that to him. So his chain of command communicated that to him. And he said that he understood and he said that, but it wasn't actually done by the police. 5 days later, he sent her a parcel and a letter. He clearly, at that point, knew the police were involved. In the letter, it's kind of quite clear. Alice promptly reported that, and she got a different police officer, because that's the way these systems work. You don't get the same person. She got a different police officer who came around, had a chat to her, and basically said to her, do you think this is harassment? He said, do you want him arrested? She said, no, I just want the stalking to stop. That police officer chose not to proceed with criminal charges. Alice subsequently said to her family, I felt completely fobbed off. They just weren't interested in doing anything. They were just looking for ways to get out of it. So nothing really happened from that. A few days later, October 11, she calls the police again because he's continuing to harass her. She tells her sister later that day, she feels like, the police aren't helping her at all. And I think to quote her, she says, they'll respond when he stabbed me. And the next day, she was found dead in her flat, having been stabbed 24 times. So that's basically the case that led to a series of inquiries. The perpetrator of that, Alice's ex-boyfriend, is now serving a 22-year sentence in prison. So she was murdered on the 12th of October 2016, having been stalked for about 2.5 months since the end of the relationship, and prior to that having been in a coercively controlling relationship for all of 8 months, maybe 9-10 months at the outside. And one of the things that the Ruggles family was very clear about in all their communications with the various inquiries was that Alice was a very outgoing, assertive woman. She was not someone who was vulnerable. And in fact, they perceived that actually may have been to her, actually was unhelpful, because when she presented to police, she was very calm. She presented, very kind of, as they described, not hysterical. She was very kind of calm about what was happening, and she was very clear. And they felt that this may have actually meant the police took it less seriously. So you're kind of damned if you do and damned if you don't. And essentially there was a series of points at which different things could have happened and didn't that ended in Alice's death. Now, whether any of those different things happening would have changed the outcome, I think, no one knows that. And I've worked with cases where things went wrong, but I think even if things had all gone right, it still may have ended the way it ended with a homicide. But that said, things clearly went wrong in Alice's case, and she clearly didn't have adequate responses.
In retrospect, if he's violated an order, surely that's the crime. It's got nothing to do with what Alice wants. He has violated an order, which he should have taken seriously, and there should be legal consequences.
This is the problem. It's a tricky situation. I do acknowledge that. But yes, I think fundamentally police have discretion about pursuing offences. And to be very frank, even the very first time she reported it, the police probably could have pursued charges at that point. And Alice clearly stated she didn't want him to be arrested. So she was clearly stating that. And this is something that you do see. And I work with police a lot, and I am sympathetic to some police are trying to maintain relationships with the person, the complainant who's reporting the offence. They don't want to drive that person away. They want them to feel like they can report things. So there is a delicate line. But I think you're right that fundamentally there comes a point when the police do have to kind of make a decision to act. And I think sometimes it's too easy not to act in these cases because there are lots of reasons not to and insufficient reasons to do it because it's hard, or at least it's perceived to be hard. And so I think that when I say to people, don't underplay how worried you are, Alice was saying that she was scared. The police knew she was scared. They ticked the box saying she was frightened on that first report. But that still didn't get communicated into the second report. The second police officer didn't record that, didn't kind of take that into account in the right way that they should have.
I know it's so easy as a woman to assume that people say, look, you're overreacting, you're over-emotional, you're overly sensitive, you're feeling guilty, you didn't end things properly, you should have just ghosted them, or you should have just done this. All these sort of kind of blaming the victim as well, things that the victim's contributing to the problem. And if your friends and family don't take you seriously, how do you get the police to?
There isn't a right thing you can do. There's not a right way of doing this that will guarantee that the right thing will happen or that it will protect you and all the things you want to happen will happen. The first thing I think is really important is to use the word stalking. If you've experienced, this repeated pattern of intrusions into your life and it's making you scared, chances are it's stalking. So use the word stalking to describe it. That's the first thing, and use the word stalking to describe it to the police, to other people. Don't try to kind of underplay it. Now, just because you've used the word stalking doesn't mean the person will get charged with stalking if the police do have a response, but that's a kind of a separate issue. But I think calling it what it is, I think, is important. The problem we have with stalking is a failure to recognise. So there's a failure to see that these patterns of behaviour are abnormal. And that's partly because they look like behaviour that isn't abnormal. So making telephone calls is not inherently problematic. Sending text messages is not inherently problematic. Leaving flowers is not inherently problematic. The problem of stalking is the cumulativeness and the unwantedness of the behaviour. And so trying to communicate in a system that doesn't see patterns, which is the systems we have with police, they don't think in patterns, they think in incidents. So as a victim, if you go to the police and say, this person has sent me these text messages or, left this thing at my house, for the police agencies I've worked with, and also the reading I've done and the knowledge I have of other police agencies I don't have direct knowledge of, part of the issue is that it's usually very difficult for the police officer who gets that report. There's nothing prompting them, or it's difficult for them in their systems to see the last time you came in and reported this, and the time before, and the time before that. So there's nothing in the systems that ties these incidents together. So you have to have a police officer who believes you, who believes what you're saying, and different people get believed differently. So they have to believe what you're saying. They have to have the time and the interest to look back in their systems and look it all up separately, because they can't just go, I'm just going to find these different reports. It doesn't work like that. It's all incident-based. And they have to recognise that a pattern of behaviour that with each single behaviour isn't a crime. So there was no threat, there was no violence, none of the single incidents were criminal, but together they're a crime. And they have to understand that. So there's so many hurdles and barriers. And then even if you get the police officer who does see all that and goes, yep, absolutely, let's go, then their sergeant has to see it as well. And then the police prosecutor has to see it. And then the magistrate has to see it. So at every single moment, every time it hits a barrier, you have to have people who understand. So if the police officer who takes that first report goes, yeah, I think this is stalking, I want to charge stalking. Quite often what happens is it gets to the point of the prosecutor, and the prosecutor goes, to prove stalking, I've got to prove a course of conduct, I've got to prove multiple things. Rather than doing stalking, let's just charge them with using telecommunication service to harass, because I don't have to prove one thing, so we can just do them like 5 times for telecommunication to harass because they made 5 phone calls. Yeah, then I've just got to prove 5 different things, and I might get 4 of them. So there's all these systemic problems that aren't actually about individual people. They're about systemic issues that mean that stalking vanishes because the systems we use to police this stuff don't make it easy to see or record or follow. That's also compounded by lack of recognition and knowledge and training and all that. Absolutely 100%. But in my work over a long time with police on these kinds of things, both in family violence and in stalking, I am of the view that you can get the biggest bang for your buck by having systems that make it easy for people to recognise. Because if they can see it, they're actually, a lot of them will act on it because they're not bad people. They want to do the right thing, but often the right thing's much, 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 much harder to do than the wrong thing, which is not seeing it and missing it and putting it aside. It is difficult because, of course, the cases that end in homicide, like Alice's, they get looked at with, 1,000 times magnification. And so all the things that go wrong, we can see it. And those cases end in homicide. And so something clearly went wrong. If I felt like there were a whole bunch of cases of stalking where everything was going right and that's why they weren't ending in homicide, I would be less inclined to be as critical of responses in cases that do. But that's not what I think is happening. What I think is happening is that pretty much all the cases are getting the same response, and occasionally it ends in homicide because homicide's very rare. That's not just my perception. There's research, there's evidence to suggest that generally police responses to stalking are pretty bad. Police don't recognise it, they don't see it, they don't try and prosecute it as soon as it's there. Not all police, it's true, it's not all police. Lots of police are doing the right thing and trying their hardest, but the systems aren't helping them to see stalking and respond to it effectively. And it's more, I would suggest, good luck than good management that we don't see more serious violence in stalking cases. And while that's happening, what we do see is vast amounts of significant psychological harm for stalking victims that's being caused regardless of physical violence, because if you are living your life with the presumption that someone is watching you constantly and could appear at any moment and might hurt you, even if they don't ever physically hurt you, they're hurting you. And we're not responding well enough to stop that.
In terms of police saying to somebody, do you want us to arrest him? That's a fairly confrontational thing when you're already fearful, as Alice was. And the last thing you want to do is escalate and inflame them even more. And if they're arrested and, unless they're going to prison for 22 years.
Which isn't going to happen, right?
Correct, yeah. And they're going to be out. They're going to be angrier at you. They're already thinking dysfunctionally. They're controlling. It's how to poke the beast.
This is one of the challenges that, so police focus on crime. Right, they say, right, has a crime occurred? Let's prosecute the crime. That's great. It's important. It's a central role of the police. Great. In these cases, they need to be as concerned, if not more concerned, about victim safety and preventative policing. Regardless of whether they're going to prosecute a crime, they need to be mindful of when this person walks out the door, the crime is still happening. How am I going to do things to disrupt that crime and to keep that person safe? Because they're not walking in reporting a theft that happened yesterday and it's over. They're in the middle of being assaulted. And when they leave the building, they're still being offended against. But that's not how police systems work. Police are reactive, not proactive.
But their role is to serve and protect. And they're supposed to be protecting the community.
Yes, I don't disagree with you at all. But that's not how police are actually funded or trained. What gets reported? How many crimes happen? Not how many crimes are prevented, right? Police get more money when there's more crimes. They don't get more money when there's less crimes. So a lot of the work that I do myself, but also colleagues of mine do, is around trying to help police understand it's not individual police, it's police agencies and systems, help them go, you need to focus on prevention in these cases, recognition, prevention. If you prosecute a crime in the process, that's fabulous. But that should be what you do as part of an overall strategy to prevent harm to these people. Sometimes the prosecution itself is the biggest risk management thing. That's the best thing you can do because prosecuting actually does stop the person. And in fact, I would suggest in a lot of cases that's a highly effective way of stopping the person. But you need to actually understand if it's going to or not. You need to actually understand what's happening and assess the risk and go, okay, putting this intervention order in place or this restraining order in place, this probably will have a deterrent effect for this particular offender because they're generally quite pro-social, they don't have other offences, and they're scared of the police. So having an order and the threat of a criminal sanction is potentially enough to stop them. There's a colleague of mine from Sweden has done some really good research showing that restraining orders are more effective in low-risk cases.
That's actually really important to know.
Yeah, right? But that's not how restraining orders are issued. Restraining orders are just holus bolus, right? You just do it. And in fact, very often here in Victoria, where I'm based, the first thing a police officer will do if you walk into a police station and say, I think I'm being stalked, they will say, well, let's get an intervention order. It's the first thing they will say every single time.
Isn't that a positive thing then?
Well, no, because there's 100,000 intervention orders in the system and they can't be policed. It's 26,000 breaches a year. So an intervention order is helpful if it's done in a thoughtful way where it's perceived that it will do something. But if the person's already been stalked for 2 months by the time they turn up and they're terrified, the right response is, well, a crime's happening and how do we keep you safe while we prosecute this crime and make sure that this person who's doing the stalking not only is held accountable for that, but also maybe gets assessed and gets the support that they need to actually stop stalking. Because that's often also the other thing. The only way a lot of these people can actually access any service is through being prosecuted, because it's through the court and through a correctional response that they actually access any sort of intervention and assessment. So people who have major mental illnesses that are unseen, from the first time it's identified is at court, because they're not in contact with mental health services. That gatekeeper role of prosecuting, remembering I said it's not just that first police officer, it's every police officer and every prosecutor and court in the chain has to all think the same thing. That's the only way that offender actually gets any sort of intervention that might help them stop stalking. This doesn't just stop in the high-risk cases. And when I say high risk, I don't just mean high risk of violence, I also mean high risk of continuing to stalk, which is also very, very, very damaging and much more common. Those cases won't just stop because the criminal justice system's got involved. That's not how it works. They need assistance to help them stop.
Is it a curable behaviour, stalking?
Yeah. Most people who stalk once. So most people who stalk don't reoffend. Reoffending rates are high. So I've done some work in Netherlands, but also here in Australia, and it suggests that probably around 50% of people who've been through some sort of criminal justice process for stalking will have further contact with police for stalking that same victim. So very common that the contact will continue. But most people who stalk won't then go on and have contact with police for stalking somebody else. It'll be this situation, this single event. And that might continue for months, maybe for up to a year or so, and then it will actually stop. From the research we've done here in Victoria, about 15, maybe 20% of people stalk multiple victims, or at least we can see in their police reports, so not charges, but they're just reported to the police and the police have identified that stalking is potentially there. About 15-20% of people who've stalked before will come back to police for targeting someone different. So not tiny, but not huge either. In your general reoffending stats, about 40% of people who've offended will offend again, in your general sense, not stalking, just generally. 40% of people who've done a crime will do another crime, right? So 15 to 20% stalked once will stalk a different victim, but that continued stalking of the same victim, more like 50-60% will continue to stalk after they've had contact with criminal justice. So it does need a response, but almost everyone who stalks will stop. So most stalking persists for about half of stalking is less than 6 months, and the other half, most of it's going between, kind of out to a year, maybe a little bit more. And then a very small number of cases, maybe like 5%, are going out beyond 5 years. So it's got this real kind of ballooning at the shorter durations, and then a long tail out into long durations. And when you're talking about those very long durations of stalking, more than 12 months out into multiple years, almost always the person stalking has a major mental illness and they need psychiatric treatment to stop stalking.
Is there any value then in a stalking register?
I know this is something that's been raised by quite a few people. It's something that the Alice Ruggles Trust, the charity in Alice's name, has talked about. It's something that there's been some cases here in Australia where people have talked about this as a response. My view is that it's probably not the best way of achieving that goal. We've got things like sex offender registers, where there's been research on those registers. They haven't been shown to have any effect on reoffending. So they don't have any kind of deterrent effect. They're enormously resource intensive to police and to maintain and to monitor. And most people do not need to be on a register. I don't disagree that the idea of making it easier for police and other agencies to link reports together and to see when people have histories is a good idea, but I think there are better ways to do that than a register that are less resource intensive, and that will allow more resources elsewhere to just police stalking more effectively and respond to stalking more effectively. And that doesn't just mean police responses, it also is things like victim advocacy services and things like in the UK they've got a national stalking helpline. So if you think you're being stalked, you can literally call a phone number and talk to someone who can talk to you about stalking. Actually, all the questions you've asked me today, in the UK, you can literally call a phone number from someone who can talk to you about all that as an individual person. And that would be a massive win. Like, from my mind, that's a hugely useful use of resources to give victims support when they feel isolated and alone. But within a policing context, I think you can achieve that linking up and that systemic change, to be honest, just by making some IT changes that mean police can type in, have these two people been involved in reports before, and it brings up a list and a summary. That doesn't need a register.
It's not a violation of privacy. The data's already in their system.
That's right. The data's in their systems. It's just not accessible. And so I know, for example, work with the Dutch police that I've done, that's literally what they did. So they had a massive inquiry after a series of homicides into the fact that their stalking responses were inadequate. And one of the recommendations that came out of that was create an IT query in their system that runs automatically every morning and picks up cases where the same person has reported being harassed by an individual multiple times. And so each day, every police station just gets hey, this person's reported twice about this same individual. Can someone have a look at this and just check out what's going on and follow it up? And then that's teamed up with a tiered risk assessment response. So if there is stalking, the next thing that happens is a screening for risk. And then if it is that, then it moves up into another level and then they get a different response, right? So you get this kind of scanning tiered response, and it's not reliant on the victim turning up every time and saying, oh, I'm being stalked, and having to explain themselves again. And it's not reliant on a police officer looking at a stalking register that might have 100,000 people on it and going, all right, well, that person's on the register. Great. Okay. You've actually got a system that says, how seriously should we take this person at this time now? Not just that everyone in a court system at some point agreed that they'd stalked before, because that's what a register shows.
How can we help to try and get something like that implemented?
I think, to be honest, what's missing is political will. Here in Victoria, we've very recently had a case not unlike Alice Ruggles in many respects. It had some very important differences in that there was no intimate relationship between the person stalking and the victim who was killed. But in other respects, it has a lot of similarities to Alice's case. There was a lot of media coverage of that case. It will, I'm hopeful, have a coronial inquiry. And that coronial inquiry, I'm very hopeful, will make recommendations as to what government should do. But even before that, when Celeste Manno, the victim in that case, was murdered back in November of 2020, the government at the time, the Attorney General at the time, Jill Hennessy in Victoria, she asked the Victorian Law Reform Commission to do a review of the stalking law here and of the systems around stalking. And they produced an interim report and then a full report, which was given to government in 2022. It had 45 recommendations for government. To date, none of those recommendations have been implemented. The Victorian Police have implemented some steps towards things that the VLRC recommended, but to my knowledge at the moment, they're the only government agency that's done anything. So I'm quite hopeful that the coronial has been delayed because the criminal case took so long. I'm hopeful that there's a coronial inquiry in that case that will make recommendations that do engender a government response, because that political will, and I don't just mean that from the politicians, I also mean it from, senior police and senior bureaucrats and people in, departments who are decision makers. So I mean political in a broad sense. That's what's needed. And fundamentally, I think there's a misunderstanding that stalking isn't very common and it's not very serious, and occasionally bad things happen, but broadly we probably do okay. And it's just an inaccurate understanding. And that's why we don't have political will, is my sense.
Thank you so much, Troy. And I'm hoping that if anyone is being stalked, that they actually now know to document with the police and keep persisting if you're not getting the response that you need. So thank you so much for joining us and helping us to educate and hopefully inform a lot better about something that I think should be talked about a lot more often.
No worries, Kathryn. Look, thank you so much for the opportunity, and I'll just absolutely agree with you there. Document, persist, and seek help, seek support from your family and friends. You're not in it alone, even though you feel like you are. Do keep pushing to get a response, because you deserve to have a response, and call it stalking, call it for what it is.
Crime Insiders Forensics is a LiSTNR original production. It's hosted by me, Kathryn Fox, and is produced by Ed Gooden. Sound design and imaging is by Link Kelly.